was different from Europe because the British Enlightenment coexisted with organized religion. Unlike in Europe and Latin America, there was never any attempt to use the power of the state to suppress Christianity. Anti-clericalism, which is mainly a phenomenon in dominantly Catholic countries, was mild. Toleration. In time, the influence of the British Enlightenment achieved what European liberalism promised: only hypocritically full religious toleration. Any attempt to suppress religion would have been fatal to the secularist cause, since each of the new nations was dominated by a strong Protestantism, whose hegemony survived until the middle of the 20th century in Canada and Australia, and even beyond that in the United States. Planted in the new nations were Evangelical Anglicanism, Methodism, the Oxford Movement, and Scottish Calvinism. Additionally, in the United States, various indigenous religions and Puritanism evolved into evangelicalism and fundamentalism. Religious prejudice merged with chauvinism so that Catholics were often accused of disloyalty to their adopted countries, but to some extent, Catholics' sheer numbers protected them from the antagonisms of that culture. Catholics in the new nations endured a great deal of hostility, but no one was ever executed for his faith, very few were killed by mob violence, and few were even imprisoned. Modernity. They were Anti-Catholicism. Anti-Catholic antagonism, as by the Masonic order, was Protestant in character, not militantly secular or anti-clerical. The Protestant ascendancy created a paradoxical situation for Catholics, in that they were often a harassed minority, but at the same time, the religiosity of the culture meant that Christian belief of some kind was almost a social imperative. Christianity assumed. While Catholics were on the defensive against Protestants, unbelievers were on the defensive against Protestant Christians, so Catholics were mostly spared the assets of anti-religious modernity. Christianity was simply taken for granted as the foundation of society, and skeptics were kept on the margins. Unlike in Europe, the governments of the new nations deputized religious ministers to witness marriage vows that were held binding in civil society and witness the signing of civil marriage licenses. There was seldom any threat to the existence of church schools, rather the major conflicts were over whether the government should fund such schools. Religious education flourished at all levels, often encouraged by the state. The faith of the immigrant. Unlike other parts of the world, in both the new nations and the British Isles themselves, immigration, both from abroad and from country to city, did not lead to massive loss of faith. A fact that was especially remarkable in the case of the Irish, most of whom had no experience of urban life prior to migrating. Instead, those urban cultures proved to be supportive of belief, and pastoral methods were successful, so that for the most part it was only in the British Isles and its former colonies that the industrial working class remained practicing Christians. Canada. The Vikings. The first Europeans to reach North America were a party under the Viking chief Leif Erikson, which reached Newfoundland around the year 1000. After the initial voyages, which led briefly to a settlement, there was no further European contact until 1500, and even then, the European powers were slow to exploit North America, because it did not seem likely to yield great profits. Quebec. The French founded the trading post of Quebec in 1608, but for a long time, New France was sparsely populated. Its chief economic resource was furs, requiring many of the males to be gone from the settlements for long periods of time living in the wild. And the colony had a reputation for moral and spiritual laxness. Near the mid-century, a group of French Jesuits, among the most heroic saints in the entire history of the Church, came to New France for the purpose of converting the Indians and had some success among the Hurons. Canada. Missionary efforts. Jogues and other martyrs. Saint Isaac Jogues was captured by the ferocious Iroquois, had his fingers chewed off, and was saved from death by being ransomed, in what became New York State, by a Netherlandish Protestant trader. Jogues returned briefly to France and were scrupulous in observing the rubrics. He would not celebrate Mass until he had received a papal dispensation from the requirements concerning the holding of the sacred elements at Mass. He returned to New France and was soon martyred by the Iroquois. This was followed 3 years later by the death of 5 other Jesuits, including Saint John de Brebeuf, who had worked among the Hurons for over 30 years. In each case, martyrdom was by a slow process of dismembering and burning, followed by cannibalism. Brebeuf was greatly admired for his strength and dedication, and the Indians ate his heart in order to assimilate his courage. But the mission was completely destroyed. Kateri Tekakwitha. Saint Catherine or Kateri Tekakwitha was the orphaned daughter of a pagan Iroquois father and a Catholic mother. She lived among the French Canadians and was venerated for her piety and works of charity. The missions. Missionary activity among the Canadian Indians was hampered by the fact that they were semi-nomadic people, which forced the early Jesuits often to follow them on their hunting journeys, to sleep on the ground, and eat their food. Some missionaries attempted, with limited success. Jesuit relations. The missionaries made strenuous efforts to learn the native languages, compiling dictionaries and other written records of those unwritten tongues. Their relations have a detailed report to their superiors in Europe on the state of the missions that paid close attention to native cultures. A new power. As in the Dark Ages of Europe, the missionaries' credibility rested to some extent on the belief that they possessed powers superior to those of the Indian shamans. The missionaries helped the Indians with their rudimentary medical knowledge, but this was a two-edged sword, because when diseases broke out, the missionaries were sometimes blamed for causing them, which they may sometimes have done inadvertently. Native religion. The Indians had their own religious beliefs, which the Jesuits tried to use as a basis for proselytization. As always, the problems of enculturation were subtle. The Indians believed in the Great Spirit, but the missionaries were reluctant to apply that term to God, lest potential converts see it as confirmation of their old beliefs. Because some of the Indians practiced cannibalism, the missionaries also did not emphasize the doctrine of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. As in many other cultures, polygamy was a major barrier to real conversion. Religion in the colony. Catholic leaders. New France was at first under the Bishop of Rouen, but Quebec was made a diocese in 1674, and its first bishop was Blessed François Laval. The colony produced some religious vocations. Laval started a seminary. French-born Sainte Marguerite Bourgeois founded the Sisters of Notre Dame of Montreal, and Sainte Marguerite Duville started the Sisters of Charity of Quebec, the Grey Nuns. The French Ursuline Marie of the Incarnation migrated to Quebec and taught children while also living the life of a mystic. The British Conquest. After the British conquest of Quebec in 1763, the new government sponsored an influx of Protestant settlers for the express purpose of ensuring a Protestant ascendancy. And it forcibly deported many of the French, living in the eastern maritime districts. The government also tried to restrict the liberty of Catholics, but when Catholics engaged in passive resistance, then rebuffed an appeal to support the American Rebellion in 1776. The Crown granted them limited toleration. The relatively few native clergy's were for a while supplemented by French priests fleeing the Revolution. Catholic loyalty. During the War of 1812, Canadian Catholics once again proved their loyalty to the Crown, which therefore removed the remaining restrictions on their freedom. Joseph Octave Plessis of Quebec, the first Canadian Archbishop. greatly expanded the church's network of schools and began the policy of urging the peasantry to remain on the land in order to preserve their culture. Religious division. Canada was officially divided, Protestants predominating in Upper Canada or Ontario and Catholics in the eastern part of the country, especially Lower Canada or Quebec. But an anti-British uprising by the Québécois in the 1830s, which the bishops opposed, led to reprisals, and in 1840, the two colonies were reunited, which gave Protestants a substantial majority. However, the Catholic minority proved to be politically skillful and managed to retain their full rights, including public funding for their schools. Growth of the Church in Canada. Canada received its first cardinal, Elzéar Alexander Taschereau of Quebec, in 1886, and in 1908, the country was officially declared to be no longer a mission territory. Outside Quebec province, there was still considerable anti-Catholicism, often a legacy of the Orangemen of the 17th century and often centered in Masonic lodges. But after the United Dominion of Canada was established in 1867, the Church, under mostly Irish bishops, grew and flourished in other provinces besides Quebec, especially because of Irish and Eastern European immigration. Catholics became prominent in Ontario, where Toronto eventually became Canada's major see. In the more remote Western and Prairie provinces, Catholics were especially ministered to by the Oblates of Mary Immaculate, who had gone to these remote regions earlier in the century to convert the Indians. In the latter part of the century, missionaries from both Canada and the United States began to evangelize the natives of the far north, often loosely called Eskimos. In Alaska, the Jesuits were in the unusual position of being in competition with a group that did not ordinarily proselytize the Russian Orthodox, who had made a number of native converts while the territory was under Russian rule. Religion in the culture of Quebec. The culture of Quebec, where Catholics virtually controlled the school system, was of the kind that the Enlightenment had undermined in Europe. Nowhere did Catholicism permeate every aspect of life as it did there: intense piety, a large number of religious vocations, the clergy as the natural community leaders, an unusually high birth rate, with divorce not permitted, and a tenacious attachment to the French language. The Québécois were sometimes dissenters from national policy, opposing massive immigration for fear that it would dilute French identity and rebuffing the call for volunteers in World War I. The shrine of Saint Anne de Beaupré in Quebec became a major pilgrimage place, as did Saint Joseph's Oratory in Montreal, which attracted pilgrims because of Saint André Bessette, a Holy Cross brother whose ill health and lack of education led to his being assigned the most menial tasks but who gained a reputation for holiness and miraculous cures. Duplessis. Quebec's status as the most Catholic society in the world climaxed during the premiership of Maurice Duplessis, when its clergy functioned as political and social leaders, and its largely rural economy, customs, language, and political loyalties were all intimately tied to religion. Duplessis' Union Nationale was often corrupt, and it systematically ignored Catholic social teaching, but it protected both French identity and the privileged place of the Church. Liberal Catholics. Effective opposition to the Union Nationale was launched in the early 1960s by a group of Catholic intellectuals who planned the long-term modernization of Quebec society. The group included the future Canadian Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau and was supported at first by Cardinal Paul-Émile Léger of Montreal. Part of its program was the repeal of laws against divorce, contraception, and pornography, a repeal that, coinciding with the worldwide upheaval dubbed the 60s, produced a powerful hedonistic reaction. Religious decline. In the years following the Second Vatican Council, the key signs of religious vitality in Quebec, its church attendance, religious vocations, marital stability, and birth rate, declined dramatically, and there was a strong reaction against the clerical authority of any kind, as popular culture zestfully embraced hedonistic ways. By 2010, Canada had the lowest birth rate in the Americas and one of the lowest rates of church attendance. Education. Catholics entered into a distinctive arrangement with the state-sponsored university system, founding their own residential colleges. Laval University at Quebec City and St. Michael's of Toronto, under the Basilian Fathers, eventually became two of the leading centers of Thomistic philosophy in the world. The United States. What would eventually become the United States of America was in colonial times, divided roughly into three zones: the Spanish Southwest, the Protestant, chiefly English, East Coast, and the French Mississippi Valley. Each had a quite distinct religious history. The Spanish. Francisco de Cordo's expedition, which included a priest, through the Southwest in 1540, shortly after the Spanish had claimed Florida. Santa Fe. Santa Fe or Holy Faith was founded in 1610. Franciscans came to New Mexico late in the 16th century, setting up reducciones or gatherings for the Indians, whose settled way of life in pueblos enabled the missionaries to enjoy some success. But here as elsewhere, they had to mount opposition to native customs, especially polygamy, and they found the Spanish soldiers as much a hindrance as a help. Unlike the more scholarly Jesuits of New France, the Franciscans seldom learned the Indian languages and instead required their converts to memorize the Latin or Spanish words for the doctrines of the Church. In 1680, a major Indian rebellion killed 21 Franciscans and many others, temporarily wiping out the Spanish settlements, which were later re-established. The penitents, a confraternity of men who wore hoods and cloaks, carried the cross in procession, and engaged in public acts of penance like scourging, began early in the Southwest and flourished long after the mission era ended. California missions. The Italian Jesuit Eusebio Kino came to the Southwest shortly after the 1680 rebellion, and the Bishop of Durango made him Vicar of California, which then included Arizona. It was Kino who established the first of the California missions. The greatest of the California missionaries was the Spanish Franciscan B.L. Junipero Serra, founded 9 missions, traveling up and down the Pacific coast mainly on foot. Serra was regarded as a saint in his lifetime and practiced penances that may have contributed to his death. The mission system. The missions were communities from which the Indians, most of whom had been forest dwellers, were allowed only an occasional vacation. They lived communally, married couples together, unmarried men and women in separate houses that were locked at night, all engaged in common agricultural and craft labor. There were to be no forced conversions, but those Indians who did convert thereby came under the authority of the missionaries. The regime was paternalistic, based frankly on the belief that the Indians were childlike and therefore required both love and a firm hand. The missionaries sought to make their communities self-sufficient in every way, and to that end implemented a strict daily schedule of prayer, work, and rest. Runaways were forcibly returned, and, as in Europe itself, corporal punishment was inflicted on those who violated the laws. European clothes were worn, churches were built with adobe mud but in the Baroque style. And Spanish was the common language, since there were over 50 Indian dialects in California and many Indians could not understand each other. Liturgy. The Indians were found to love music and imagery, so the friars made use of both for purposes of evangelization, encouraging native artists to compose sacred songs, paint religious scenes, and act out dramas illustrating the life of Christ. The missionaries often preached about the terrors of hell that awaited the unrepentant. Pagan survivals. As had occurred after the conversion of Rome, the missionaries sought to Christianize the Indians' calendar through the observance of holy days in place of pagan feasts. As with every other enterprise of mass conversion in the history of the Church, the Indian converts retained many of their old customs and beliefs. On the border between what was merely social and what was religious. The liturgy on feast days spilled over into fiestas celebrations that retained pagan elements, and many Indians probably lived in a dual religious world in which the old deities and powers were still real. Long before California was a wine-producing area, for example, the failure of wine to arrive from Mexico might prevent the celebration of Mass for long periods. The end of the missions. The era of the California missions was relatively brief. Enlightenment influences had caused the Jesuits to be suppressed in Spain, and by the 1770s, the same influences had reached California, causing the government to reorganize the Indians into self-governing pueblos independent of mission control. Serra opposed the experiment, which soon failed. Around 1800, the Indian population began to decline sharply, because of disease. Texas. Missions were established in Texas also in the early 18th century, but many were later abandoned. Mission San Antonio became a fort. Florida. On the East Coast, the first permanent settlement in what would become the United States was St. Augustine, in what would later be Florida. Founded by the Spanish, it was eventually taken by the English and lost its Hispanic character. In 1634, Charles I of England appointed a Catholic convert, Cecil Calvert, Lord Baltimore, to be the proprietor of the new territory of Maryland, which was officially named for Queen Henrietta Maria. Although Calvert probably intended to honor the Virgin Mary, the first settlement was called St. Mary's. Maryland was not a Catholic colony, merely a place where Catholics could worship freely. The ship's Ark and Dove, the Catholic Mayflowers, brought the first settlers, including 2 Jesuits, although a majority of the settlers were Protestants. Soon an attack by Protestant Virginians burned St. Mary's and forced the governor and the 2 Jesuits to flee briefly. Catholic estates were plundered and 4 Catholics were Toleration. Subsequently, the Maryland Toleration Act forbade harassment or persecution of anyone who believed in Jesus Christ, making Maryland the only colony, other than predominantly Baptist Rhode Island, to allow this freedom. Despite the fact that the Calverts were in effect the owners of the colony, events there depended heavily on the English government. The Toleration Act was passed a few months after Charles I was beheaded in a rebellion led by Puritans. Protestants soon seized the government of Maryland and repealed the act. However, it was reenacted at the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. After the Glorious Revolution overthrew the Catholic James II in 1688, Maryland was made a royal colony. The English penal laws against Catholics were declared to be in force, and conformity to the Church of England was required. Catholic life. Catholic life in Maryland mirrored Catholic life in England itself, in that it was centered on the estates of the gentry and dependent on the sufferance of the government. Some Catholics remained influential, but there were apostasies, including members of the Calvert family. The Jesuits. The Jesuits supported themselves by farms of their own which, like those of the gentry, were often worked by slaves. Some effort was made to convert the Indians. The few priests traveled constantly on horseback to visit small communities where Mass was usually celebrated and baptisms, confessions, marriages, and funerals conducted in private homes. The Carrolls. Charles Carroll of Carrollton was one of the most important men in Maryland, a signer of the Declaration of Independence and a strong supporter of the American Revolution. His cousin John Carroll studied in Europe, as was common for upper-class Maryland Catholics, and became a Jesuit. After the suppression of the society, John returned to Maryland and ministered to the flock who lived around his mother's estate. At the outbreak of the Revolution, he was part of a delegation sent to Canada to seek Canadian neutrality. A mission that failed because England had recently granted religious toleration to the Quebec Catholics. The first bishop, John Carroll, like Charles, was an ardent patriot, proclaiming Catholic support for the Revolution and the new government. After the war, he was the leader of a group of priests who told the Holy See that it was inappropriate that they should continue under the authority of the Vicar Apostolic of London. Carroll himself was first made Prefect Apostolic over the United States, then in 1789, the first American bishop, in effect elected by his fellow priests and confirmed by Rome. There were then about 25,000 Catholics in the 13 new states, about 1% of the population. In 1808, dioceses were established in Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Bardstown or Kentucky, and Baltimore became an archdiocese. Religious liberty. Before appointing Carroll, the Holy See queried the fledgling American government as to whether the appointment was acceptable and received the surprising answer that it was of no concern to the government. At that time, and for a long time afterward, the United States was the only country in the world where it was possible for the Church to erect dioceses and parishes, establish charitable and educational institutions, and appoint clergy without at least the formal approval of the government. Most important, in theory, this religious liberty was not conferred by the state but was a natural right enjoyed by all, so that the Church did not have to depend on concessions wrung from unfriendly governments through fragile concordats. Democratic ideas. In general, Carroll opposed bringing foreign priests to America, and in keeping with the spirit of the new nation, he at first proposed to the Holy See that bishops in America be elected by the senior clergy, and that the United States be free of the authority of the Congregation of Propaganda, and that Mass be celebrated in the vernacular, accommodations that he thought would make the Church appear less foreign and more democratic. But as he began to exercise episcopal authority, he apparently changed his mind about those matters. Sulpicians. Paradoxically, in order to train clergy for a new country that had been spawned by a revolution, he found it necessary to welcome French Sulpicians fleeing the revolution in their own country. For 2 generations, the Sulpicians were perhaps the most important religious community in America, with a number of them, including 2 of Carroll's successors, serving as bishops. They started St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore, which Carroll hoped would be the seedbed of native vocations, although for a long time most students were foreign. In 1793, the first priest ordained in the United States was the French Sulpician Stephen Badin. Religious women. Native vocations among women were more plentiful. A half-dozen new congregations were established around 1800, notably the Sisters of Charity, founded in Maryland by the aristocratic convert St. Elizabeth Ann Seton. Remarkably, the first woman to become a nun from what would eventually be the United States was not a Marylanda but Lydia Longley, a Puritan girl from Connecticut who was kidnapped by Indians and taken to Canada, where she was eventually ransomed and entered a convent. A free church. In his famous work Democracy in America, the French Catholic nobleman Alexis de Tocqueville informed Europeans that the fact that there was no official church in the United States did not indicate irreligion but quite the opposite. Nowhere was religion the subject of such interest, and the churches were stimulated to great efforts in order to win free adherents. Religious indifference. But the radical newness of this arrangement raised questions that would take a long time to resolve. Catholic teaching held that the state had an obligation to promote religion and morality. While, in practical terms, it was an immense benefit for Catholics to live in a neutral state, that very neutrality seemed to show that the American state did not accept its responsibility. This was a problem for many Protestants as well. No one proposed an official national church, but until the 1830s, some individual states still retained official churches. And some people were troubled by the absence of any mention of God in the Constitution. Common morality. For a century and a half, after the Constitution was ratified, the prevailing view was that all religions fostered a common morality that was the necessary basis of a good society. People of all religions were presumed to be able to live harmoniously together under a state that was neutral toward specific religions but not toward religion as such. The Second Great Awakening. Practically all the Founding Fathers were influenced by the British Enlightenment, and some were deists. But the views of this elite soon ceased to be the governing spirit of the new nation. As the shift from republicanism to some kind of equalitarian democracy gave greater weight to the beliefs of people who were largely unaffected by the Enlightenment, to the dismay of President Thomas Jefferson and others, there occurred a great resurgence of evangelical faith, the Second Great Awakening that stamped on the country a deeply Christian character that survives into the 21st century. Religious rights. Despite the prevailing anti-Catholicism, Catholics found that their rights were generally protected by the Supreme Court, which at various times confirmed the legal independence of private religious colleges, upheld the right of churches to import foreign clergy, recognized Catholic marriage as satisfying civil requirements, allowed the Church to receive bequests, permitted tax exemptions to religious bodies, held that charitable institutions under religious auspices were not sectarian and could receive public money, and found that a monk's vow of poverty did not violate the constitutional guarantee of personal liberty. A crucial feature of the American legal system was the principle that internal church disputes, if brought before the secular courts, were to be decided according to the Church's own laws. In order to minimize the possibility of governmental interference in internal church affairs. Education. The environment was so favorable to religious education that in 1844 the Supreme Court seriously considered the claim that prohibiting the teaching of religion in a privately endowed school constituted blasphemy. The court allowed the innovation only because the donor had no malicious intent toward religion. For a long time, private religious colleges far outnumbered state institutions in the United States, and Catholics took full advantage of the opportunity, eventually founding almost 300 institutions of higher learning, not including seminaries, vastly more than in any other country. The first, Georgetown, was established by Carroll in 1789, and the Jesuits alone eventually founded 28 such institutions. Over time, colleges were also opened by the Dominicans, the Holy Cross Fathers, and other male orders, while colleges for women were opened and operated by religious sisters. Lay trusteeism. The democratic American spirit threatened the integrity of the Church in one important respect: lay trusteeism. Although it had European roots and some of its most ardent supporters were immigrants, lay trusteeism seemed to harmonize with the Puritan ecclesiastical system called Congregationalism. In some cases, parishioners claimed title to the parish property and the right to hire and fire their pastors, even to elect their bishops. But it was not primarily a lay clerical rivalry. In almost every case, the dispute centered around two rival pastors, one appointed by the bishop, the other by the trustees, occasionally involving public brawls between rival factions. The disputes raged on and off for decades, especially on the East Coast. The Holy See condemned lay trusteeism as a violation of canon law, and bishops sometimes excommunicated dissidents. Some bishops allowed lay trustees in an advisory capacity, so long as the bishop retained title to the parish property and the authority to appoint and remove pastors. Finances. The democratic character of the Church in the United States was also reflected in the fact that it was heavily dependent on the free will offerings of the faithful. Despite poverty, Catholics built often imposing churches and funded charitable institutions of all kinds, which, since most Catholics were poor, required a large number of small contributions. A common method of parochial support was pew rental, which allowed the better-off people to sit in the most desirable locations for Sunday Mass and left the majority to find whatever places they could. The French. De Soto. In the second of the three ethnic religious zones that became the United States, a Spanish expedition under Hernando de Soto got beyond the Mississippi. A Franciscan member of that party, Juan de Padilla, remained to convert the Indians in what is now northeast Kansas, soon becoming the first North American martyr, year 1542. Marquette and Joliet. In the later 17th century, Jesuits from Canada began doing missionary work throughout the Great Lakes region. Based on Indian stories about a great river, the Jesuit Jacques Marquette, and the layman Louis Joliet, rediscovered the Mississippi and traveled much of its length. They originally named it the Immaculate Conception, but the name did not stick. The French eventually reached the Gulf of Mexico and claimed the entire Mississippi Valley. Indian missions. The Jesuits penetrated south from the Great Lakes, establishing a series of Indian missions throughout the upper part of the Mississippi Valley and also ministering to the few French settlers attracted to the area by the lure of furs. There were some missionary martyrs. The Plains Indians were nomadic hunters, which hampered the missionary efforts, and polygamy was once again a great obstacle to conversion. It was common among the Indians, and the French trappers often took Indian concubines. An arrangement that was considered objectively sinful but that also often served as the missionaries' entry into Indian society. In the 18th century, the Franciscans and the Society of the Foreign Missions of the Seminary of Quebec also began sending priests into the territory. Lead and other minerals were discovered on the west side of the Mississippi, bringing an influx of settlers into what would later become Missouri. New Orleans. New Orleans was founded in 1718, and from there, French settlements were established to the north along the Mississippi, so that in time there was a continuous, albeit sparse, chain extending from the Gulf of Mexico to the Great Lakes. The first academy for Catholic girls in what would become the United States was established by the Ursulines in New Orleans in the Upper Mississippi. Following the 7 Years' War 1756 to 1763, France had to cede the Illinois country to England and transfer the west side of the Mississippi to Spain. Although the majority of the white inhabitants of the valley were still French in origin, the territory ceded to Spain was placed officially under the Diocese of Havana, but in practice, it remained under Quebec, which, since England now ruled Canada, also had jurisdiction over the Illinois country. The transfer of the territory to Spain led almost immediately to the expulsion of the Jesuits and therefore to an acute shortage of priests. The Americans. During the American Revolution, rebel forces advanced into the Illinois country, and Pierre Gibault, d. 1804, who was virtually the only priest left in the territory, persuaded his mostly French parishioners to welcome the Americans. After being returned to France under Napoleon, the Louisiana Territory was sold to the United States in 1803, giving the new nation unlimited access to the rest of the vast continent. After the Louisiana Purchase, the territory was quickly settled by Americans-Easterners of mainly British Protestant stock, and its French character was diluted. Louisiana. The Diocese of Louisiana was established in 1815, but the Creole clergy in the state of Louisiana were said to be Gallicans who resisted the reform programs of their bishops. The first bishop, the Sulpician Louis Dubourg, d. 1833, a native of Santo Domingo, was essentially driven out of New Orleans by the clergy and moved his seat to St. Louis, which became a diocese in 1826. Despite its heavily Catholic character, Louisiana never exerted proportionate leadership in the church nationally. The Upper Mississippi. Bishop Benedict J. Flaget of Bardstown, a French Sulpician, found the Catholics of the Upper Mississippi Valley, who had been without priestly guidance for years at a time, to be also extremely lax. But around 1820, an influx of missionaries began a revival. Flemish Jesuits, French Sacred Heart Sisters, and a multinational group of Vincentians arrived in Missouri almost simultaneously. Originally committed to evangelizing the Indians but increasingly devoted to the pastoral needs of white people. Saint Rose Philippine Duchesne, superior of the Sacred Heart Sisters, established schools for girls throughout the Louisiana Territory. The Vincentians and the Jesuits both established seminaries barely 100 miles apart, and the Jesuits took charge of a school that eventually became St. Louis University, the first university west of the Mississippi. Badin was an intrepid missionary in Kentucky and territories farther west, as was the Flemish Sulpician Charles Nerinx, who founded the Sisters of Loretto at the foot of the cross to establish schools on the frontier. In the new state of Michigan, the French Sulpician Gabriel Richard was a major figure in civic life, a founder of the state university and Michigan's first congressman. Ironically, he was in jail for debt when he was elected. Eclipse of the French. The Irish Bishop Peter Richard Kenrick of St. Louis discouraged French priests from serving in his see when he first arrived in 1841. A few years later, the first Bishop of Little Rock, the Irishman Andrew Byrne, arrived with a contingent of Irish priests, whereupon all the French priests departed. The Indians. The relentless westward push of white settlers led to the repeated seizure of Indian lands, the forcible relocation of their occupants, and the frequent breaking of treaties by the federal government. During the 1830s, the Jesuits from Missouri began extensive evangelization of the Indians, following the Missouri River all the way to Montana and establishing a chain of missions across the northwestern tier of the country. Missionaries were almost the only white people involved with the Indians whose motives were not mercenary, and the famous Flemish Jesuit Pierre de Smet attempted, with limited success, to represent the Indians' interests. Mission rivalries. Another obstacle to Catholic missionary activity was aggressive competition with Protestants. As the Indians came under the authority of the federal government, the various tribes were assigned to different churches, usually favoring the Protestants. The only instance in American history when the church's pastoral activity was restricted by law. For educational purposes, the government provided financial support for the missions and tended to overlook the fact that a major part of that education was religion. Westward Movement. After 1840, the new nation began to advance westward into the Hispanic areas of the continent, beginning with the Anglo-Texans' rebellion against Mexico, which led to the Mexican War that brought Texas into the Union. The gold rush of the 1840s brought many people to California, including many Catholics, and fostered the popular image of California as the Promised Land. Temporarily leaping over most of the territory between the eastern Rocky Mountains and the western Sierras, the United States accepted California into the Union in 1850. The Holy See established a vicariate for Texas and dioceses in Los Angeles and Santa Fe and solidified the ecclesiastical organization of the vast country by making Oregon City, later Portland, and St. Louis archdioceses. Eclipse of the Spanish. As it had done in the Mississippi Valley, the Westward Movement diluted the older ethnic character of California Catholicism, so that in time Hispanics found themselves outnumbered by the Irish and under the authority of mainly Irish bishops. The survival of Hispanic culture was strongest in New Mexico, but the celebrated Archbishop John Baptiste Lamy of Santa Fe III was a Frenchman who considered the conduct of his Hispanic priests and the folk piety of his flock less than satisfactory. He ignored the classic Spanish mission style of architecture and built a cathedral in Romanesque style, in order to emphasize the European heritage. An immigrant church. From the beginning of the new nation, there was continuous immigration, much of it by Catholic Irish. But the great age of immigration began shortly after 1840, coinciding exactly with the beginnings of the Great Westward Push. The Irish were by far the largest Catholic immigrant group, with over 4 million in the period 1820 to 1920. Germans were the largest immigrant group, overall 5.5 million, but only a fifth of them were Catholics. Thus the religious and ethnic character of both the East and the Midwest altered substantially. People of British ancestry gradually ceased to constitute a majority in the East, while, paradoxically, Catholics in the former Louisiana Territory now constituted a much smaller percentage of the population but grew hugely in terms of total numbers. Americans. The fact that Carroll came from a distinguished aristocratic family had much to do with public acceptance of his faith and conversions to the Catholic Church from the upper echelons of society. Since the Holy See sought to appoint native bishops when possible, throughout the 19th century, a disproportionate number of bishops, 2 of them Carroll's successors at Baltimore, were drawn from the ranks of converts, usually former Episcopalians. There was some dissatisfaction with the French clergy, especially bishops, who were considered autocratic and were accused of not bothering to learn English, although the first bishop of Boston, Jean de Chevreuse, was respected even by Protestants. The ethnicity of bishops. Most bishops were Irish, if for no other reason than that they spoke the dominant language. But most of the earliest Irish bishops were not even working in the United States when appointed and were sent from abroad specifically to assume office. The first 2 bishops of New York were Irish Dominicans stationed in Rome, the first of whom got no closer to New York than Naples. French bishops were sometimes suspected of Gallicanism, while the Irish bishops were strongly ultramontane. A rare Czech appointee, St. John Nepomucene Newman, the Redemptorist Bishop of Philadelphia, became the only canonized member of the American hierarchy. John England. Paradoxically, Carroll's Americanist ideas were especially kept alive by one of the immigrant Irish bishops, John England of Charleston, who had been a strong supporter of the independence of his native land and who extolled the American idea of liberty as the hope of the world. England promulgated a constitution for his diocese, including an elected body of laymen to advise the bishop. Although all matters pertaining to the faith remained under the authority of the clergy. Architecture. Carroll's idea of Americanization was reflected in the dominant early style of church architecture. His cathedral in Baltimore was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, who also designed the new Capitol in Washington, D.C., as well as the cathedrals in Bardstown and Cincinnati. Like his civil buildings, all of Latrobe's churches were built in the Federal, or Greek Revival, a style favored at the time, though it was not distinctively religious. But by the time of the Civil War, American Catholics' increasing links to Europe were architecture. Carroll's idea of Americanization was reflected in the dominant early style of church architecture. His cathedral in Baltimore was designed by Benjamin Latrobe, who also designed the new Capitol in Washington, D.C., as well as the cathedrals in Bardstown and Cincinnati. Like his civil buildings, all of Latrobe's churches were built in the Federal, or Greek Revival, a style favored at the time, though it was not distinctively religious. But by the time of the Civil War, American Catholics' increasing links to Europe were reflected in the revival of Romanesque, Gothic, and Baroque styles, which predominated in church architecture until World War I. Growth. By 1870, the number of Catholics had increased to 4.5 million, 12% of the total population. Until 1914, the United States allowed almost unlimited immigration, a policy that especially favored Catholics from Southern and Eastern Europe, Italians, Poles, Hungarians, Slovaks, and others. With this increase in the Catholic population in 1875, came the appointment of the first American named a cardinal while holding an American see Archbishop John F. McCloskey of New York. After that, the country was never without a representative in the Sacred College, 2 in 1910, 4 in 1924, and 5 in 1946. Anti-Catholicism. Both the elite and the masses in the Mississippi Valley were mostly Catholic at the time of the Louisiana Purchase, and Catholics there were never treated as outsiders, even as Americans poured into the territory. But in the East, especially New England, the Anglo-Saxon elite openly regarded Catholics as interlopers who had to be kept in their place, while in the West and Southwest the native Hispanic population was often treated as a conquered people. During the Mexican War of the 1840s, American troops sometimes desecrated Catholic churches, which provoked some of the Irish in their ranks to desert the Mexicans, who named them the San Patricio Brigade. Know-nothings. Prior to the Civil War, when massive immigration was still new, anti-Catholic violence, collectively dubbed the Know-Nothing Riots after a loosely organized secret society, erupted in several cities of the United States. A convent school was turned to the ground near Boston, a papal nuncio was mobbed in Cincinnati, and a stone sent by Pius IX for the new Washington Monument was dumped into the Potomac. The fraudulent memoir of a supposed nun I leaped over the wall spread the most lurid tales of convent life. While some of this anti-Catholic hostility was nativism-hatred of foreigners at its core, it was religiously motivated. Some immigrants, especially Germans, were freethinkers who fomented anti-Catholic prejudice against the Church as the principal enemy of civilization. Elite prejudice. The crudity and violence of popular anti-Catholicism were sometimes condemned by the Protestant elites, but those elites harbored their own kind of prejudice, which was a combination of the classic Protestant view of Catholicism as a distortion of Christianity and the Enlightenment claim that it was repressive superstition. Elite opinion deplored the syllabus of errors and the definition of papal infallibility and favored both Italy's seizure of the Papal States and Germany's Kulturkampf. For a time, Harvard Law School would not admit graduates of Jesuit colleges, on the grounds that their education did not qualify them. Ethnic parishes. Irish bishops in the United States, in contrast to the efforts of the Quebec hierarchy to preserve French culture, found the immigrant culture of their non-English-speaking flocks troublesome. Ethnic parishes were ubiquitous but were often sources of tension. Germans. There were few German bishops except in the state of Wisconsin, where St. Francis de Sales Seminary at Milwaukee was the principal training ground for German-American priests, and after 1880, there were practically no bishops except Irish and German. German Catholics lived in all parts of the country but especially in the German Triangle stretching between Cincinnati, St. Louis, and Milwaukee. During the 1880s, the movement called Kehenslyism, named after a German layman who was head of society to fund the American missions, complained to the Holy See that German Americans were treated as second-class citizens and asked that they be given more German bishops, a plea that was rebuffed. Schism. Other ethnic groups considered themselves to have even less influence. The only schism in the history of the United States, the Polish National Church, was founded in Scranton, Pennsylvania, in 1896 by Poles unhappy with their Irish bishop. It remained small and marginal. The language issue. Strictly speaking, there were no Irish parishes as such, merely parishes where English was the language of confessions and sermons, and ethnic parishes were regarded as concessions. In St. Louis, for example, large and imposing churches built by German Catholics were officially considered mere chapels of ease of English-speaking parishes. Ethnic parishes were sometimes considered obstacles to the assimilation of immigrants into American culture, but the reality was more complex. They allowed immigrants to ease into the culture over time and minimized culture shock, preserving the old languages and customs even as the second generation became Americanized. Germans in particular were devoted to parish schools, as places where their language and customs could be passed on along with their religion. The fidelity of the immigrants. Some bishops in the United States thought it was urgent that the immigrants settle in rural communities, and a few, such as the otherwise modern-minded John Ireland of St. Paul, even sponsored projects for re-establishing the European pattern of farming communities, with the Catholic faith at their center. But ironically, it was precisely certain rural areas that turned out to be dangerous to the faith, as the sheer size of the country made it difficult to provide priests for much of the South and West. And many immigrants became Protestants. By contrast, the Church was highly successful in providing for the pastoral needs of her mushrooming urban flock. While there were many thriving Catholic agricultural communities, especially in the Midwest, American Catholics became predominantly urban people. Overall, the immigrants kept their faith, and the system of ethnic parishes had much to do with that fact. Education. Parochial schools. The common schools, which began to spread after 1850, were objectionable to Catholics because they were essentially Protestant, requiring prayers and readings from the Protestant Bible, often led by ministers, and punishing Catholic children for not participating. Catholics began establishing their own schools in large numbers around the time of the Civil War, and the Third Plenary Council of Baltimore, Baltimore 3. 1884 mandated that all parishes sponsor them. A decade later there were 4,000 throughout the country, enrolling 750,000 children. Baltimore 3 also authorized what came to be called the Baltimore Catechism, which was used in Catholic schools for the next 80 years. The bishops were not in total agreement about educational strategy. Some agitated to make the public schools religiously neutral, but that effort succeeded only in Cincinnati, where it was promoted primarily by freethinkers, with Catholic and Jewish support, and was criticized by some Catholics for making public education secular. Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul for a time promoted a cooperative arrangement between Catholic and public schools, a proposal that some other bishops opposed and that public school officials also eventually rejected. In 1925, the Supreme Court, pronouncing, "The child is not the mere creature of the state," overturned an anti-Catholic Oregon law requiring all children to attend public schools. But the Church was rarely successful in getting tax support for her schools. The Catholic schools. Partly because of the perceived Catholic sympathy for slavery, the Republican Party after the Civil War increasingly exploited anti-Catholic and anti-immigrant feelings. President Ulysses S. Grant seemed to give in to such prejudice in urging that no public funds be given to Catholic schools. and a Republican effort in Congress to initiate a constitutional amendment to that effect failed in a purely partisan vote. Politics. Brownson. Virtually the only Catholic intellectual of substance in 19th-century America was Orestes Brownson, a spiritual seeker who passed through Calvinism, liberal Protestantism, Unitarianism, agnosticism, and the utopian Brook Farm experiment before becoming a Catholic. Brownson thought the time had come for the United States to lead the world spiritually, but it could do so only if it abandoned a weak and compromised Protestantism for an unwavering Catholicism. Sternly orthodox, Brownson was nonetheless suspect because for a time he also made common cause with liberal Catholics in Europe, such as Montalembert and Acton. He extolled American democracy and opposed the establishment of Catholic schools, proposing instead that Catholics serve as leaven in the public schools. His great critic, and perhaps the most influential American Catholic journalist of the 19th century, was also a convert, James A. McMaster of the New York Freeman's Journal, who strongly opposed every liberalizing tendency in the Church. Eventually, Brownson came to mistrust pure democracy, as tending toward a kind of philosophical relativism. And he supported a theory held especially by many Southerners whereby the individual states could nullify an act of the federal government. But unlike many other advocates of states' rights, Brownson was also vehemently anti-slavery and supported the Union and Civil War, Romanism, and rebellion. Due to the Republican opposition to funding Catholic schools and other reasons, Catholics, especially the Irish, flocked to the Democrats, demonstrating their power in 1884. When a Protestant minister sneered that the Democrats were the party of Romanism and rebellion cost the Republicans New York City and thereby the presidential election. In the northern cities, Catholics partly coped with discrimination by mastering the arts of democratic politics, taking advantage of their constantly growing numbers to elect their own people to office. The Irish were especially skillful at urban politics, putting together the machines that survived into the 1960s and beyond. Labor unions. Catholics' adherence to the Democratic Party also owed much to their status as mostly laborers, since the Republicans, in both image and reality, were the party of business owners. Catholics became leaders in the emergent labor movement. The Holy See condemned the Knights of Labor, an early union headed by the Catholic Terence V. Powderly, calling it a secret society akin to the Masons because it kept its membership secret and required its members to take an oath. But Cardinal James Gibbons of Baltimore persuaded the Vatican to lift the ban. Catholic life in America. The Sisters. The Church's mission was heavily dependent on the labor of sisters, who greatly outnumbered priests and who, besides teaching, were the chief ministers of charity in hospitals and orphanages and in the personal care of invalids and the destitute. They worked heroically during the frequent epidemics, lived among the very poor in the cities, endured the most extreme hardships and dangers on the frontier, and often died young. Many foreign orders came to the United States, notably the Sisters of Mercy from Ireland, the Daughters of Charity from France, and the School Sisters of Notre Dame from Germany. The Italian immigrant Saint Francis Xavier Cabrini, who founded the Missionary Sisters of the Sacred Heart to work in hospitals and other institutions. 1946 became the first American citizen to be canonized. Congregations also continued to be established in America. Rose Hawthorne Lathrop, the converted daughter of American author Nathaniel Hawthorne, founded a community of sisters primarily to care for indigent cancer patients. Lay organizations. Possibly because of the democratic, voluntaristic character of American society, religious organizations of all kinds flourished. The Holy Name Society for Men, the Altar and Rosary Society for Women, the St. Vincent de Paul Society to help the poor, and ethnic organizations of all kinds. An Irish priest in Connecticut, Michael McGivney, founded what became the largest and most important of these, the Knights of Columbus. Its name was chosen to recall the Catholic origins of the nation. Each of these groups had a predominantly religious purpose, but they also served as social organizations and provided life insurance and aid to members in need. Along with the church and the school, they constituted a complete Catholic world. Piety. As in Europe, devotions of all kinds, the rosary, novenas, and shrines to various saints, the 40 hours devotion were extremely popular, as was the parish mission in which visiting priests, especially Passionists or Redemptorists, preached every night for a week. These missions were the Catholic equivalent of the Protestant revival, aiming at personal conversion, with exhortations to greater piety and severe warnings against common sins like drunkenness. American Catholics were very faithful in going to confession, with long lines on Saturdays and before great feasts. Slavery. Few Catholics were involved in the anti-slavery movement, and many regarded the movement as a malign effort by extremists to undermine the social order with the concept of liberty that had proven to be destructive in Europe. On the other side, some abolitionists, such as the Presbyterian minister Elijah P. Lovejoy, who was murdered by a mob in Illinois, were as much anti-Catholic as they were anti-slavery. Papal condemnations. Since the 15th century, the popes had condemned the slave trade. And one of the ways in which a self-consciously American Catholicism diverged from Rome in the 19th century was precisely on the slavery issue. Bishop England was pro-slavery, and most of the Catholic elite of Maryland and the lower Mississippi Valley, Bishop Carroll among them, owned slaves, with little apparent crisis of conscience. Some religious communities owned slaves, and one Maryland superior was removed by the Jesuit general for having allowed slave families to be broken up through sales. Pro-slavery Catholics. The Supreme Court's Dred Scott decision, holding that slaves had no rights, was written by Chief Justice Roger Brooke Taney, a Marylander who achieved the highest office held by any American Catholic prior to 1961. Several Maryland Catholics were implicated in the plot to assassinate Abraham Lincoln, although the extent of their involvement is unclear. Despite the repeated papal condemnations of slavery, few clergymen called for emancipation, a rare exception being Archbishop John B. Purcell of Cincinnati. The only American textbook of moral theology, by the Irish Archbishop Francis P. Kenrick of Baltimore, justified the institution and, citing St. Paul's letter to Philemon, even defended the highly controversial fugitive slave law, which required that runaway slaves be forcibly returned to their masters. The Civil War. Catholics fought on both sides in the Civil War, although Louisiana was the only Confederate state that had a large Catholic population. There was an impression at the time that most Irish tended to be pro-Confederate and most Germans pro-Union, and Irish Catholics were among the chief perpetrators of the anti-draft riots in New York City, during which more than 100 people, mostly blacks, were killed on the streets. Bishop Patrick N. Lynch of Charleston was sent as a Confederate emissary to Pius IX to persuade the Pope to recognize the Confederacy officially. The Pope's response is uncertain. It was rumored that he was open to recognizing the Confederacy if slavery were abolished. Meanwhile, Bishop Michael Dominic of Pittsburgh, a Spanish Vincentian, attempted to promote the Union cause in Europe. Reconstruction. Southern Catholics resisted Reconstruction, and Bishop William H. Elder of Natchez, who later succeeded Purcell in Cincinnati, was briefly jailed for disobeying the orders of the occupying Union Army. By a narrow margin, the Supreme Court overturned the conviction of a Missouri priest who, under orders from Archbishop Peter Kenrick, refused to take an oath of loyalty to the Union. Wage slavery. Some Catholics, such as Archbishop John J. Hughes of New York, criticized the North in the same way that some Southerners did, arguing that the plight of the industrial laborer was, if anything, even worse than that of the slave, who was often cared for throughout his entire life by his master, because the factory worker was trapped in an entirely heartless and impersonal system that, caring only for profit, often paid him less than he needed to live. Black Catholics. Despite widespread racial prejudice among American Catholics, Augustine Tolton, who was born a slave in Missouri, became the first black priest in the United States. Rebuffed by various American seminaries, he completed his studies at the College of the Propaganda in Rome and worked in black parishes in Illinois. James A. Healy of Portland, Maine, the son of a white father and a slave mother, was the first black bishop in the United States and until the 1960s the only one. Religious orders. The Josephites, an offshoot of the English missionary Mill Hill Fathers, were a male community founded primarily to work among blacks. Elizabeth Lang, a Cuban immigrant of Haitian ancestry, and a New Orleans black woman, Ven. Henriette DeLille, both founded communities of black sisters, the Oblates of Providence and the Sisters of the Holy Family, respectively. Saint Catherine Mary Drexel, daughter of an aristocratic Philadelphia family, used her fortune to establish the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, who worked among black and Indian women and welcomed their membership. She also founded the nation's only black Catholic university, Xavier of New Orleans. Americanism. Bishop Dominic, although he was Spanish, gave offense at the First Vatican Council by predicting that Catholics in the United States would not only soon outnumber those in Italy, but would also be better Catholics. It was a speech that foreshadowed the greatest crisis in the history of the Church in the United States: Americanism. The exact nature of Americanism was vague. A few people advocated a vernacular liturgy, the abandonment of distinctive habits for nuns, and a respectful ecumenical dialogue with Protestants, but on the whole, the movement was merely a rather uncritical enthusiasm for American society. The leaders were often impulsive and given to battle cries such as "Church and Age Unite." Sometimes they demanded that the American political system be followed everywhere. John Ireland. Archbishop Ireland, who was dubbed the Consecrated Cyclone, was the leader of the Americanist bishops. He dismissed the contemplative monastic life as unsuited to American culture and was an almost frenetic champion of the greatness of the nation, seeing himself as engaged in a great battle for the direction of the American Church. Despite his enthusiastic belief in the principle of separation of church and state, he often meddled in politics to promote his ecclesiastical agenda, assimilating the immigrants. Although Ireland championed labor unions, he got on well with some of the leading businessmen of the Gilded Age and was unusual among Catholics in being an ardent Republican, seeing Catholic loyalty to the Democratic Party as a further sign of their failure to enter fully into American society. The American Church of his day was all too obviously a community of immigrants. And on one occasion Ireland exclaimed in exasperation that he would welcome a return to the conditions of John Carroll's day, when the flock was much smaller but was also truly American. Temperance. Ireland was also embarrassed that the Irish immigrants had a reputation for drunkenness and criminality, and he urged temperance on his people. An Irish Franciscan, Theobald Matthew d. 1856, promoted the temperance movement with evangelical fervor, considerable episcopal support, and some success. Gibbons. Gibbons served as the Americanists' protective patron, no one doing more than he to establish the image of the Church as completely at home in American society. A bishop for over half a century, Gibbons appeared to the public as a simple, kindly, a humorously self-deprecating man imbued with the democratic spirit. He was routinely called upon to offer public prayers on patriotic occasions and, although the Church did not allow official ecumenical activities, regularly appeared alongside non-Catholic clergy, with whom he seemed to enjoy cordial relations. Although the War of 1898 was fought against Catholic Spain, and although many Catholics for various reasons opposed American entry into World War I, Gibbons epitomized the patriotic spirit, giving proof that a Catholic could be a loyal American. Catholic University. The Catholic University of America was founded in 1888 directly under the hierarchy and intended to be mainly a graduate institution for clergy. Some of its founders, Bishop John Lancaster Spalding of Peoria and its first rector, Bishop John J. Keene, were Americanists who also intended it to be a more modern institution than the Jesuit schools they considered reactionary. Keene insisted that little emphasis be placed on the study of the Middle Ages. Apostolic Delegation. The Apostolic Delegation was established in the United States in 1893, mainly because of complaints to Rome by American priests that they were being mistreated by their bishops. The most famous case was that of Fr. Edward McGlynn of New York City, who was excommunicated by Archbishop Michael A. Corrigan, the leader of the anti-Americanist bishops, for espousing radical social ideas like the single tax movement and for denouncing Corrigan as a tool of wealth. Ironically, most of the Americanist bishops had been born in Ireland, whereas Corrigan was a native of New Jersey. The first apostolic delegate, Archbishop Francesco Satoli, reinstated McGlynn and was for a time friendly to the Americanists. Later he seemed to ally himself with the conservative wing of the hierarchy led by Corrigan. Vatican involvement. Although it had been building up for decades, the Americanist crisis erupted primarily because of the first religious community for men founded in the United States, the Paulists. The community was started just before the Civil War by Isaac Hecker, a convert from Methodism who, like Brownson, was briefly associated with the utopian Brook Farm experiment. Hecker became a Redemptorist but was dismissed from that community after a dispute with his superiors. Also, like Brownson, Hecker believed that the United States, as a land of innovation and hope, was ripe for conversion to Catholicism. Because the Church affirmed human freedom and the possibility of natural virtue, he emphasized the presence in each person of the Holy Spirit, inspiring and guiding good actions. In contrasting Catholicism with the theological pessimism of classical Calvinism and Lutheranism, he appeared not to notice the growth of a liberal Protestantism that was even more optimistic than Catholicism. Without his saying so explicitly, Hecker's hope seems to have been that the United States could be converted through its social elite, who had first been shown that Catholicism was not a foreign entity but something that resonated with American culture at the deepest level. A number of the early Paulists were converted, some from prominent families, one an astronomer at Harvard. The crisis came to a head at the end of the century in a roundabout way through a French translation of a biography of Hecker written by one of his priests. Based on the book, liberal French Catholics claimed to discern certain distinctive progressive features of American Catholicism, a claim that, along with reports to Rome from the United States itself, prompted a Vatican investigation. Pope Leo XIII sent 2 letters to the American bishops Longginka Oceani and Testem Benevolentii arguing that, while separation of church and state was tolerable, it need not be adopted everywhere and that the state should give positive support to religion. The Pope's diplomatic rebuke urged American Catholics not to exalt their own culture at the expense of the universal Church or value the natural over the supernatural virtues and the active over the contemplative life. The Phantom Heresy. Americanism has been called the Phantom Heresy because it was in no sense a real heresy, merely a set of attitudes that, carried far enough, might have become heresy. The Americanists submitted to the papal warning, with Gibbons saying that he knew of no one who actually held any of the censured opinions. Because of Americanism, Keene was replaced as a rector of the Catholic University. Modernism in the United States. Pius X's condemnation of modernism a decade later raised the question of whether Americanism was a species of the same thing. But the connections were tenuous. Although Ireland once offered Alfred Lewisy a professorship in the St. Paul Seminary, the Americanist leadership seemed to have little understanding of the doctrinal issues at stake with modernism. When Ireland and Spalding visited France, Lewisy was disappointed that they did not seem interested in the questions that exercised him. Insofar as modernism was an issue in the United States, it was in the still gray area of modern biblical criticism. The Paulist William Sullivan was deeply affected by that criticism, concluding that the true meaning of the gospel lay in its moral teachings and excoriating the Church because of her dogmatic tradition, which, he charged, was completely out of step with American democracy. He left the Church and became a Unitarian minister. 5 other Paulists resigned from the priesthood because of the condemnation of modernism, as did the Jesuit theologian William Fanning and John R. Slattery, the general of the Josephites. John Zame, a Holy Cross Father, was censured by the Holy See for cautiously espousing the theory of evolution. The New York Review, published at the New York Archdiocesan Seminary, was suppressed after it published articles on biblical criticism and summaries of modernist theology. Henry Pole, a Netherlander who was a professor of scripture at Catholic University, was forced to resign and, although the Americanist bishops sometimes presented the issue as one of academic freedom, they, in turn, forced the resignation of a German priest professor whom they regarded as their enemy. The American Church matures. Growth. Just as Catholic intellectual life in Europe was by no means thwarted by the condemnation of modernism, so the Catholic Church in the United States flourished in the 60 years following the warning against Americanism. Over the next 60 years, American Catholics came to be considered exceptionally loyal to the Holy See. Even after immigration was severely restricted, the American Church continued to grow exponentially from 10 million members in 1914 to 45 million 50 years later. Its various institutions multiplied, religious vocations were plentiful, and there was a high level of mass attendance. Foreign missions. The United States ceased officially to be a mission country in 1907. And, while it would continue to receive priests from abroad, it would increasingly send its own sons and daughters to the most distant parts of the world. In 1911, 2 Boston priests founded the Foreign Mission Society of the United States, commonly called MAG-ARAL, which became one of the most important missionary groups in the Church, especially for its services in China. Monasticism. Another sign of the maturing of American Catholicism was the slow development of contemplative monasticism. In the 1840s, Trappist houses were established in Kentucky and Iowa. For many decades, most of the monks were from Europe, but in the 20th century, Americans too began to join. The Church and social issues. The social apostolate. Rerum Novarum was well received in the United States, even by some secular liberals. And there was a strong sense of social Catholicism fostered in particular by German Americans influenced by the work of von Ketteler and others. The Zentralkatholik Verein functioned as both a fraternal organization and a movement to propagate the German school of Catholic social thought. Labor unions. It was not obvious, however, how European corporatism fit in America, and in practice. Catholic social thinkers settled for the more pragmatic stance of supporting labor unions and condemning both unrestrained capitalism and socialism, which for a time had a large following in the United States. A Minnesota priest, John A. Ryan, was the leading exponent of this social Catholicism, integrating all aspects of Catholic social thought by emphasizing the crucial importance of the family and society's obligation to support its integrity. The restoration of society. Immediately after World War I, the bishops, advised by Ryan, issued a proposal for the restoration of society that resembled in many ways the programs of the secular progressives of that era, albeit arrived at by an entirely different philosophical route. The proposal called for public works projects to stimulate employment, freedom for trade unions, minimum wage laws, compensation for the unemployed and the disabled, and heavy taxes on great wealth. The Catholic valuation of community was contrasted with modern individualism. Faced with the growing claim that poverty required some families to practice birth control, Ryan insisted that the solution was the just wage and various kinds of public support. The bishops exhorted women to withdraw from the workforce, in order to devote themselves to their families, and some bishops opposed child labor laws, on the grounds that they constituted undue interference with the autonomy of the family. The New Deal. Based on the bishop's 1919 statement, the New Deal of President Franklin Roosevelt 1933–1945 seemed to Ryan and others to be the fulfillment of Catholic social teaching. Bishop Francis Haas of Grand Rapids served on several government commissions, and Roosevelt's policies were also strongly supported by Cardinal Mundelein and a few other prelates. Because of this seeming episcopal endorsement, and because of their own working-class status, American Catholics were among the strongest supporters of the liberal welfare state. Coughlin. During the New Deal, neither Ryan nor Mundelein was the most audible Catholic voice on social questions. A Canadian priest living in Detroit, Charles Coughlin, for a few years had a national radio program and published a magazine, both of which attracted a wide following by no means exclusively Catholic. Coughlin offered highly provocative judgments about a range of issues. Starting from an Orthodox Catholic base, his criticisms of the free market soon led to passionate condemnations of capitalism itself, which he claimed was essentially a conspiracy whereby a few plutocrats controlled the world by manipulating governments. At the same time, he rejected socialism. He offered, however, no clear alternative to the systems he condemned. At first, Coughlin strongly supported the New Deal and saw Roosevelt as a kind of savior. But he soon condemned Roosevelt as himself a servant of wealth, and he increasingly identified Jews as the principal malefactors in international affairs. His attacks on Roosevelt and his anti-Jewishness led to strong criticism in Catholic circles, and at the beginning of World War II, he was forced to give up his public career. At the instigation of the Vatican. Dorothy Day and the Catholic Worker. A very different kind of Catholic social witness was that of Dorothy Day and her Catholic Worker movement. Although the movement never attracted more than a small handful of people, it was widely known through its newspaper A Penny a Copy, which pricked the consciences of many middle-class Catholics and attracted considerable secular notice as well. Day was a convert from communism in the fevered world of the New York radicalism of the Great Depression. She started the Catholic Worker in 1933, at the beginning of the New Deal, in order to witness the gospel by living a life of voluntary renunciation and dedication to the poor. an idea she considered far more radical than Marxism or other materialist doctrines. The Church in the Modern World. Anti-Catholicism. Perhaps because the Church's growth seemed to threaten an eventual Catholic dominance, anti-Catholicism remained strong. The Know-Nothings were succeeded by the American Protective Association and the Ku Klux Klan. The latter starting as an anti-black vigilante group after the Civil War that revived after the First World War with anti-Catholicism and anti-Jewishness on its agenda as well. In 1928, the Catholic governor of New York, Alfred E. Smith, was decisively defeated as the Democratic candidate for president, a defeat in which overt anti-Catholicism played a major role. In his public statements, Smith minimized his religion as much as possible, and Americanist Catholics sometimes seemed to underestimate the degree of this anti-Catholicism. Thinking that it could be diffused by demonstrations of goodwill and moderation. Gibbons had discouraged the formation of an organization to defend the Church, although, after the First World War, the bishops set up the National Catholic Welfare Council to represent Catholic interests in public life and began to hold annual meetings. Popular culture. Despite this hostility, American Catholicism began to blend into popular culture, a process of enculturation to American mores that took place half instinctively, without much conscious reflection. There were, however, sources of tension between Catholicism and the forces of secularization. Alarmed over mounting complaints about morality in entertainment, the film industry chose a Jesuit, Daniel A. Lord, to write a code that would govern Hollywood productions for almost 40 years. A code whereby sexual subjects were to be handled with restraint and good would always triumph over evil. During the 1940s, priests were highly sympathetic characters in a series of popular films: Boys Town, Fighting Father Dunn, Going My Way, The Bells of St. Mary's, and The Miracle of the Bells. The first two films were about actual priests, one of whom, Edward Flanagan, d. 1948, of Boys Town in Omaha, attained legendary status for his pioneering efforts to reclaim delinquent boys through trust and love rather than through severe discipline. On a visit to his native Ireland, Flanagan openly criticized the treatment of troubled boys by Catholic institutions, condemning the kind of brutality that would become a public scandal 50 years later. Ironically, however, this popular adulation of the priest in one way did little to make Catholicism more comprehensible to non-Catholics, since his sacramental role was treated merely as a kind of ceremonial adjunct to his real work of helping those in need. Taken at face value, such films denied the reality of sin by portraying apparent evil as merely the result of misunderstanding or neglect. Beginning in 1920, the football team of the University of Notre Dame, hitherto a relatively obscure Midwestern school, was perennially among the best in the nation, attracting a huge following among Catholics who had never attended college and even many non-Catholics. The close link between religion and football players said they were honored to play for Our Lady's School and received communion before every game made Catholic piety seem normal and manly to people who might have otherwise thought of it as strange and superstitious. Catholics in the wars. Nativists accused Catholics of being disloyal to their adopted country, but in both world wars, heavy Catholic participation, and stories of heroic chaplains, refuted the charge. Catholics' patriotism was further demonstrated by their fervent anti-communism during the Cold War of the 1950s, which was motivated by the atheism and religious persecution perpetrated by communist regimes in Eastern European countries to which many American Catholics traced their ancestries. Encouraged by their spiritual leaders, American Catholics prayed for the conversion of Russia at the conclusion of every Mass and saw history as climaxing in a titanic struggle against godlessness, in which America's chief enemy was also the chief enemy of the faith. Sheen. Catholic radio programs of various kinds began to multiply during the 1930s, and, unpredictably, during the 1950s. One of the most popular figures in the new medium of television was a bishop who was a veteran of Catholic radio. Fulton J Sheen, the national director of the Society for the Propagation of the Faith, produced weekly telecasts that actually drew audiences away from variety shows and situation comedies. Sheen was famous for bringing well-known converts into the church, the author and ambassador Clare Boothe Luce for example. And his lectures and books effectively expressed the spirit of the 1950s in their philosophical critique of secular culture, their anti-communism, and their insistence that faith in God was the only answer to both personal and social problems. Sheen was a kind of ecumenist, in that he refrained from criticizing Protestantism, and he attracted many non-Catholics. To Catholics, he spoke warmly of such things as Marian devotions and the Pope, but to more general audiences he offered a message that the God of Catholics, Protestants, and Jews would bring peace of soul and comfort from the trials of modern life. A flourishing church. The 2 decades following the Second World War were, in measurable terms, the peak of American Catholic history, with a high rate of church attendance, abundant religious vocations, and a strong sense of loyalty to the Holy See. The United States was generous in sending both people and money to the foreign missions, and the maturing of its religious life was proven by the growing attraction of the contemplative life for which Archbishop Ireland had seen little value. The Trappists could scarcely build monasteries fast enough to accommodate the influx of vocations. Suburbia. With almost total success, the Church also faced a new material challenge: the massive movement of people from cities to suburbs, requiring the sudden establishment of many new parishes, or the expansion of old ones, in the same way that massive immigration from Europe had been accommodated in the previous century. In an era of large families, the typical new suburban parish built its school first and held services in the gymnasium until it was possible to build a church that, when finished, was often so utilitarian that it was indistinguishable from many other buildings.
Forward lang po natin, ano, kasi magte-10 na. So, ayun pa yung mga church in the modern world. We have this, yung topic natin na makikita rin naman, yung Episcopal leadership, the Anti-Catholicism, the religious liberty, and lahat ito patungkol doon sa United States po, para makarating tayo doon sa yung isang sa isang bansa pa, which is the Australia, para magkaroon din tayo ng tawag dyan, knowledge, or makita natin, may enlighten tayo dun sa church ng Australia.
Australia. The continent that would become Australia was discovered by the Portuguese in the 16th century but was not settled by Europeans until 1788, when unique among the nations of the world. It was established by Great Britain primarily as a penal colony on what would become New South Wales on the mainland and an island called Van Diemen's Land. A quarter of the convicts were Irish, both from Ireland itself and from England, including a few convict priests. A minority of the prisoners had been convicted of political offences, but most were common criminals whom the chaplains found to be virtually incorrigible, given to drink, sexual license, and violence, and seldom open to religious influence. The English Benedictine William Olathorn, who came to Australia in 1833, reported that conditions of convict life were so intolerable that those who were sentenced to death rejoiced and those who were reprieved wept. He lamented that the few priests were morally not much better than those they served. Catholicism. The first Mass ever celebrated in Australia was in Sydney in 1803, the celebrant being a convict Irish priest. But after an insurrection a year later, the government disallowed further priestly ministrations and required all convicts to attend Anglican services. According to legend, the reserved Blessed Sacrament was left behind when the last priest was deported from Sydney. And for several years it was the center of devotion for the handful of free Catholics living there. Catholic chaplains were restored in New South Wales in 1820. Their salaries paid by a British government that weighed the hope that religion would reform the prisoners against the fear that priests might stir up further resistance. Catholic services were not allowed in Van Diemen's Land until the 1840s. Official policy vacillated with each governor. For a time, for example, all orphan children were placed in Anglican institutions, to be raised in that faith, and priests were not allowed to visit Catholic soldiers in military hospitals. But eventually, these and other restrictions were lifted. The end of transportation. Convicts who had served their sentences were ordinarily freed and could seek to enter the mainstream of society. Transportation of convicts to New South Wales ceased in 1840 and to Tasmania in 1854. Free settlers began immigrating from Europe, a great many from Ireland, but they tended to be very poor, a fact that, combined with the convict legacy, made the overall tone of Australian society, as many of the clergy saw it, uncivilized and irreligious. Holding. The Church in Australia was first under the Vicar Apostolic of London, then under the Vicar Apostolic of the French colony of Mauritius. In 1834, the Diocese of Sydney was established, its first bishop being the Benedictine John Bede Polding, who had been Alathorn's teacher in England. Alathorn became Polding's Vicar General, handling administrative matters for the bishop and serving as the target of numerous attacks by disgruntled priests and laity. Before long, Alathorn returned to England, where he became a prominent bishop. The Monastic Dream. For some years, Polding's apostolate was governed by a unique dream that the Church in Australia would be organized on the basis of Benedictine monasticism, which, as in the Dark Ages, would serve as the spiritual center radiating outward. But the dream was not well suited to the actual conditions of the continent, and even Alathorn came to think it was impractical. The monastery Polding founded in Sydney had its own troubles, leading some of the monks to leave the community, and the diocesan clergy strongly resisted the monastic idea, which was eventually abandoned. During the 1840s, several new dioceses were established, and Polding was made an archbishop. A scattered flock. Polding himself tacitly admitted its impracticality by his own heroic, almost ceaseless, pastoral work traveling vast distances on horseback, visiting remote settlements that had not seen a priest in years, living away from his monastic community for long periods. Most of his flock were Irish, and increasingly, against his better judgment, he began importing priests from Ireland, a policy that soon produced another kind of tension. The practice of the faith was also hindered by the number of people who left the coastal cities for the bush, where the shortage of priests made it difficult, even impossible in some cases, to provide adequate pastoral care. Priests who did serve in those remote areas, away from episcopal oversight, might themselves fall prey to alcohol or lax sexual mores. Some managed to get control of substantial tracts of land, including land that was supposed to belong to the church, forcing bishops to battle both lay trustees and pastors who claimed personal ownership of their parish property. Aborigines. Pius IX reminded the Australian bishops of their responsibility for the Aboriginal natives, and Polding considered their treatment a disgrace, an instance of civilized Europeans perpetrating barbarism. The Spanish bishop José Serra of Western Australia succeeded in obtaining legislation to protect a people who in some cases were victims of what amounted to genocide. For the most part, however, the laws remained unenforced, and mission efforts among a largely nomadic people had only limited effect. The Irish. Also during the 1840s, large numbers of Irish began arriving in flight from the potato famine, and a gold rush in Victoria in the 1850s brought many more. The condition of the immigrants was often miserable. Holding undertook to meet each arriving ship, in order to aid in a transition to a new life, and a widow, Caroline Schism, did heroic work among the immigrant children. The Irish were unshakable in their ethnic identity, of which religion was a crucial part, but bishops judged that for some ethnicity was by far the more important part of their identity. Such that Irish who were fiercely loyal to their religion might also be extremely lax in its practice. One estimate placed the rate of regular church attendance at less than a quarter, and many parents did not bother to ensure that their children received religious instruction. Irish clergy. As time went on, most of the men appointed bishops in Australia were Irish, many of them sent out directly from their homeland. A large majority of the lower clergy were also from Ireland. The first native Australian priest was ordained in 1867, but vocations remained relatively few. Irish bishops sought to reproduce in Australia the ecclesiastical patterns that prevailed in their homeland, where the clergy was the natural leaders of oppressed people. In Ireland, Catholics almost always married Catholics, for example, so in Australia, the hierarchy officially forbade mixed marriages, a rule that was often evaded or ignored. Irish bishops were known for their authoritarian ways, an extreme example being John Brady of Perth, who summarily expelled a community of Spanish Benedictines from his diocese, forcing them to embark on a 3-day journey on foot during Holy Week, carrying the cross as they went. Brady was removed by the Holy See in 1850 but refused to recognize the decree and, supported by a mob, at one point scuffled with his appointed successor in the sanctuary of a church. Excommunicated, he returned to Ireland still considering himself Bishop of Perth. Vaughan and Moran. When Polding died, he was succeeded by another English Benedictine, Roger Vaughan, Bishop of Hobart, Tasmania, whose appointment was strongly opposed by the Irish bishops. When Vaughan died on a visit to England, his successor was Patrick Moran, a bishop in Ireland who was Cullen's nephew and had served as his secretary. Such were the prevailing ethnic feelings that Moran coldly informed Vaughan's brother, the future Cardinal Herbert Vaughan of Westminster, that there was no interest in Australia in returning Roger's body for burial in his cathedral, something that did not happen until 1946. Barely a year after his appointment, Moran was made the first Australian cardinal, an honour that was rumoured to be compensation for his having been passed over for the Archbishopric of Dublin. A surmise given credibility by the fact that after Moran's death no other Australian prelate received the red hat for 35 years.
Forward lang natin and then siguro yung iba, tignan nyo na lang po dun sa ating no? Para yung ibang na-miss nating mga mabalikan po ninyo or ma-review po ninyo. So, kasi mag-aalas 10 na. So, yan, ito na lang yung last part. Parang mag-end doon sa sa Australia.
The movement. During World War II, communists managed to gain a significant foothold in some Australian labour unions, and thereby in the Labour Party itself, and after the war, again with Mannix's full blessing. Santa Maria embarked on an organised campaign to expel the communist influence, employing the same tactics of secret organisation and infiltration that the communists themselves used. There were 5,000 members of this Catholic social study movement, which came to be called simply the movement. In 1945, the Archdiocese of Sydney suspended its support for the official Catholic action body of which Santa Maria was an official, and the movement, now calling itself the National Civic Council, went its own way, without official approval. In 1954, a prominent Labour Party leader denounced the movement in the strongest terms, implying a Catholic plot to take over the party. As a result of which many Catholics withdrew from the party and others were expelled. The movement then proved capable of influencing so many voters that for almost 2 decades the Labour Party was kept out of office at the national level. This split in the Labour Party accelerated a trend whereby Catholics, as they entered the ranks of the middle class, moved away from Labour and toward the Liberal Party, which had long been thought of as a Protestant bastion. Only a few months before Manox's death, it was the Liberals who enacted what the Australian bishops had so long sought, and what Labour had so long failed to deliver: public aid to private schools. The movement's influence was primarily in Victoria, since from the beginning Archbishop Kelly, and later Cardinal Gilroy, considered the Melbourne version of Catholic action far too independent and both the movement and Manox himself far too confrontational. Gilroy presented his case in Rome, and the Vatican ruled that Catholic action groups should not engage in politics, a ruling that was allowed to stand despite Manox's personal appeal to Pius XII. Thus events of the post-war period opened a split between Melbourne and Sydney Catholicism that persisted for decades. Growth. In 1935, only 17% of Australians were estimated to be Catholics, half of them regular churchgoers, a decline from earlier times that was due partly to drift away from the church. But substantial Catholic immigration occurred after World War II, raising Catholics' proportion of the population to 27%. The future of the new nations. Although weaker than it had been 50 years before, Catholicism in the United States in the Third Christian Millennium was in many ways healthier than anywhere else in the Western world. Ironically, this may have been due mainly to the continued vitality of conservative Protestantism, which helped sustain an overall social climate favorable to religion. By contrast, neither Canada nor Australia had a significant movement that could be called evangelical or fundamentalist, and, as those countries became less Protestant, in a sense they also became less Catholic. The Church everywhere in the West faced the question of what, if any, presence she could have in a pluralistic society. The history of the new nations, which had wrestled with that question from their beginnings, provided perhaps the best guidance.
So with this, glory to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit. Magandang gabi po.
Thank you very
Magandang
much.
gabi rin po. Salamat po.
Okay, so we just close. Sandali lang po.